The case you're about to hear didn't begin with racism. It didn't begin with hatred or even raised voices. It started the way so many American neighborhood disputes do. A simple disagreement between neighbors that should have ended with a conversation and a compromise. But instead, it took a turn no courtroom, no community, and no family should ever have to endure. Because somewhere along the way, one sentence was spoken. A sentence so cruel, so revealing, that it instantly changed what this case was really about. When the neighbor mocked a family's skin color, not behind closed doors, not in private, but right in front of their children, the courtroom didn't erupt. It went silent. The kind of silence that tells you everyone in the room understands a line has just been crossed. In that moment, this stopped being about property lines or parking spaces or money. This became about dignity. About what kind of behavior America is willing to excuse, and what it absolutely will not. And if you believe that respect should never depend on the color of someone's skin, you'll feel this case in your gut, the same way millions of people at home did. This is one of those moments where viewers don't even think before hitting like, because they know what's coming next matters. And what Judge Judy did after hearing those words shocked even the bailiff standing beside her. The family sitting at the plaintiff's table that day did not look like people who wanted to be in court. They looked like people who had been pushed there. They were a working-class Black American family, two parents who had spent their adult lives doing exactly what they were told was the American way. They worked, paid their bills, raised their kids, and stayed out of trouble. No drama. No history with the law. No habit of complaining. They weren't activists, influencers, or people looking for attention. They were just a family trying to live quietly. The father worked long hours, the kind that start early and end late, the kind where your back aches but you keep going because your kids are watching. The mother balanced a job of her own with everything else that comes with running a household. School schedules, meals, homework, doctor appointments, and the invisible emotional labor that never shows up on a paycheck. They didn't have luxury cars or designer clothes. What they had was routine, structure, and pride in keeping their home together. They had chosen their neighborhood carefully. It was quiet. Tree-lined streets. Kids riding bikes. Neighbors who mostly waved and minded their own business. For years there were no issues at all. No arguments. No complaints. No police calls. They weren't loud. They didn't host parties. They didn't bother anyone. They believed they had found exactly what every parent wants. A place where their children could grow up feeling safe. The problem started small. Almost embarrassingly small. A shared driveway. A parking space that technically belonged to one property but had been used casually by both sides for years. At first it was nothing more than a look. Then a comment. Then a note left on a windshield. The family tried to handle it the American way, politely, calmly, without escalation. They moved their car. They adjusted their routine. They didn't argue. But the comments didn't stop. They started hearing little things. Not loud enough to cause a scene, but clear enough to sting. Complaints about how things were done around here. Remarks about standards. Statements that didn't sound openly aggressive, but carried an edge that made the parents look at each other and silently ask the same question. Did you hear that the way I did? Still they tried to ignore it. Because that's what a lot of families like theirs are taught to do. Don't make trouble. Don't escalate. Don't be labeled. Just keep your head down and move on. And for a while they did. Until their kids started hearing it. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't screamed. That almost made it worse. The children overheard comments while playing outside. While walking to the car. While sitting on the front steps after school. Words spoken casually as if they were harmless observations. But words that carried a message no child should ever have to process. Questions about whether they belonged there. Suggestions that they be more comfortable somewhere else. Statements that made it painfully clear who the neighbor believed the neighborhood was really for. That's when everything changed. Because parents can tolerate a lot when it comes to themselves. But when it reaches their children, the line is no longer flexible. The mother testified that she began noticing changes in her kids. One stopped wanting to play outside. Another asked questions no parent is ever prepared to answer. Questions about why someone didn't like the way they looked. Questions about whether they had done something wrong just by existing. They went back to trying reason. Calm conversations. Clear boundaries. Requests to keep things respectful. Instead of de-escalating, the behavior intensified. More comments. More tension. More moments that left the family feeling like guests in their own home. Eventually, the neighbor filed a claim first, accusing the family of causing problems, of disrespecting shared space, of creating issues that never existed before they moved in. The amount? Just over $2,000. Parking-related damages. Alleged inconvenience. Petty on paper. But when the family responded, it wasn't because they wanted money. It was because they wanted it to stop. Their counterclaim wasn't about profit. It wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness. About accountability. About drawing a line and saying, "You don't get to speak to us this way and pretend it means nothing." Sitting there in the courtroom, the parents didn't sound angry. They sounded tired. Tired of explaining themselves. Tired of being polite in the face of disrespect. Tired of pretending that words don't matter when they echo in the minds of children long after they're spoken. They weren't asking the court to fix society. They were asking the court to acknowledge something simple and deeply American. That dignity isn't optional, and it doesn't depend on where you live or what your skin looks like. The neighbor, by contrast, looked far too comfortable sitting in a courtroom. From the moment they were called forward, there was an air of smug confidence that immediately set them apart from everyone else in the room. This wasn't the posture of someone nervous about a judge's ruling or concerned about how they were being perceived. This was the posture of someone who believed they were untouchable. Someone who had walked into that courtroom assuming the outcome would naturally tilt in their favor. They sat back in their chair with their arms crossed tightly across their chest, chin slightly raised, eyes drifting around the room as if this were an inconvenience rather than a serious legal proceeding. When the family spoke, the neighbor didn't listen. They sighed. They rolled their eyes. They shook their heads slowly as if enduring something tedious. More than once, they muttered under their breath, loud enough to be noticed but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't intentional. When it was their turn to speak, they didn't wait to be invited. They talked over the family, over the questions, over the process itself. Their tone wasn't loud, it was dismissive, condescending. The kind of voice that implies the other side isn't just wrong, but ridiculous for even trying. They repeatedly referred to the family as dramatic, waving a hand as if brushing off something insignificant. Every concern was minimized. Every emotion was reframed as exaggeration. If the family described discomfort, the neighbor scoffed. If they described fear or tension, the neighbor smirked. "This is being blown way out of proportion," they said casually, as if that alone should end the case. "People are just too sensitive these days." That phrase landed heavily in the room. Too sensitive. It was said with practiced ease, the way people say things when they've used that line before and gotten away with it. The implication was clear. The problem wasn't the words spoken, it was the people who dared to be affected by them. Responsibility was shifted effortlessly, without a trace of self-reflection. As the neighbor spoke, their body language never softened. Their arms stayed crossed. Their shoulders stayed back. Their expression hovered somewhere between bored and amused. When the family's attorney tried to clarify a point, the neighbor interrupted. When Judge Judy asked a direct question, the neighbor answered, but often added unnecessary commentary, injecting opinion where only facts were requested. At one point, as the family described how the comments affected their children, the neighbor let out a small, audible laugh. It was brief, almost deniable, but it was real, and it didn't go unnoticed. Judge Judy's eyes lifted immediately. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her pen down. She simply looked directly at the neighbor and held that gaze long enough for the room to feel it. "You're here to answer questions," she said calmly, evenly. "Not perform." The words were measured, but the message underneath them was unmistakable. This was a warning. For the first time, the neighbor paused. Just for a moment. Then they nodded quickly as if humoring the situation and leaned back again. The confidence didn't disappear. It hardened. The smirk returned. The eye-rolling resumed. When asked about prior complaints, the neighbor brushed them off as misunderstandings. When asked about the tone of their comments, they insisted everything had been taken the wrong way. Over and over again, they positioned themselves as the reasonable one in the room, the victim of an overreaction. "I never said anything bad," they insisted. People hear what they want to hear. Each denial was delivered with the same dismissive cadence, the same refusal to acknowledge impact. It wasn't just what they said, it was how effortlessly they absolved themselves of responsibility. The neighbor spoke as if harm could not exist unless they personally agreed it did. As the questioning continued, the contrast between the two sides grew sharper. The family answered carefully, choosing words with restraint. The neighbor answered loosely, confidently, sometimes sarcastically. The family leaned forward when speaking. The neighbor leaned back. And all the while Judge Judy watched. She didn't interrupt often. She let the neighbor talk. Let them explain. Let them minimize. Let them frame the situation however they wanted. But with each passing minute, the tension in the room thickened. It became clear that the neighbor believed they were winning, that their confidence, their attitude, their refusal to concede even a small point was working in their favor. They were wrong. But they didn't know that yet. What they did know was that they felt comfortable. Comfortable enough to keep talking. Comfortable enough to keep dismissing the family's experience. Comfortable enough to believe that this was just another situation they could explain away with a shrug and a clever line about sensitivity. The explosion hadn't happened yet. No voices were raised. No verdicts were issued. But something was building, slowly, quietly, as the neighbor continued to dig deeper into their own words, unaware that each one was being carefully noted. And Judge Judy was letting it happen. As the hearing moved forward, the family began to describe something that no longer sounded like a single misunderstanding, but a pattern. Not one comment taken out of context. Not one awkward exchange that could be brushed off. A pattern that had stretched over months, slowly tightening like a vice. They explained that the remarks didn't always come the same way. Sometimes it was a passing comment. Sometimes it was said with a smile. Sometimes it was delivered quietly as if meant only for them to hear. But the message underneath never changed. They described how the neighbor would comment on how the neighborhood used to be. How things had changed. How certain people stood out. Each remark, taken alone, might sound harmless to someone determined not to hear it. But stacked together, week after week, they formed something unmistakable. The parents spoke carefully, choosing their words with restraint, explaining that what hurt most wasn't just the comments themselves. It was the sense of being watched, judged, and unwelcome in a place they called home. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly as the testimony continued. Then the evidence came out. First, the text messages. Printed copies were handed up, neatly organized and dated. Messages sent late at night complaining about parking, about noise that wasn't happening, about children running around too much. Messages that didn't contain explicit insults, but were laced with irritation and accusation. The kind of messages that made it clear the neighbor was not simply annoyed, they were fixated. Judge Judy scanned the pages silently, her expression unreadable. Next came the voicemail. The father explained that the message had been left after they didn't respond to a text quickly enough. The recording played through the courtroom speakers, filling the room with the neighbor's voice. It was sharper than their tone in court. Less polished. Complaints delivered with impatience, frustration, and a sense of entitlement. The message ended with a warning, not a threat exactly, but something close enough to make the point land. The courtroom remained quiet as the recording ended. Judge Judy didn't react immediately. She simply looked back down at her notes. Then came the statement from another neighbor. This neighbor had no dispute with the family. No financial stake. No reason to get involved, except that they had witnessed multiple interactions over time. Their written statement described overhearing comments that made them uncomfortable. Remarks about who fit in and who didn't. Comments said casually but repeatedly. The statement ended with a sentence that stood out. It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like resentment. Judge Judy looked up. She began asking questions, not speeches, not lectures. Short, precise questions. The kind designed to strip away ambiguity. How often did you contact them? When did these messages start? Why did you feel the need to comment on their children? Did you leave this voicemail? Each question was direct. Each answer was recorded. And with each one, the pressure in the room increased. The neighbor responded with the same strategy they had used from the beginning. Minimize. Deflect. Dismiss. It was a joke, they said lightly. They're taking it the wrong way. That's not how I meant it. Over and over again, the same phrases appeared as if rehearsed. The neighbor insisted there was no hostility, no intent to harm, no responsibility for how the words landed. According to them, everything existed in a vacuum, words without weight, comments without consequence. Judge Judy didn't argue. She didn't challenge them directly. She simply continued asking questions. Why didn't you stop after they asked you to? If it was a joke, why repeat it? What's funny about telling someone they don't belong? The neighbor shifted slightly in their seat. Not enough to look uncomfortable, just enough to show that something was changing. Their answers became longer, less confident. They began explaining instead of responding, justifying instead of answering. The family watched quietly as the back and forth continued. They didn't interrupt. They didn't react. They had already said what they needed to say. Now the case was speaking for itself. The viewers at home could feel it building. The rhythm had changed. The case was no longer drifting. It was narrowing. The evidence wasn't explosive yet, but it was stacking up, piece by piece, forming a clear picture. The neighbor's insistence that everything was harmless began to sound hollow when placed next to timestamps, recordings, and witness statements. Judge Judy leaned back slightly, pen resting between her fingers. She glanced once more at the paperwork, then at the neighbor, then at the family. Nothing had happened yet. No verdict. No raised voice. No viral line. But everyone in the room and everyone watching could sense it. The moment was coming. And when it did, there would be no room left for excuses. Judge Judy let the room settle before speaking again. The papers were stacked neatly in front of her. The evidence had been heard. The explanations had been given. The excuses had been exhausted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lecture. She simply looked directly at the neighbor and asked one question. Slow, deliberate, impossible to dodge. Did you say those words? For the first time since the hearing began, the neighbor hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, but it was noticeable. Long enough for the room to lean in. Long enough for the family to tense. Long enough for anyone watching to understand that this was the moment everything hinged on. The neighbor glanced down, then back up and gave a small shrug. Yes, they said. But it wasn't meant like that. There it was. Encouraged by their own answer, they continued as if honesty would somehow protect them now. They repeated the statement, not loudly, not angrily, but casually. A remark about skin color being out of place in the neighborhood. A comment about how some people stood out more than others. Words framed as observation, not insult. The kind of phrasing people use when they want to say something hurtful without owning it. Then came the excuse. It was just a joke, the neighbor added quickly. I didn't mean anything by it. People are way too sensitive these days. The words hung in the air. There was an audible reaction from the gallery, not shouting, not outrage, just a collective intake of breath. Gasp. Murmurs. A sound that said everyone in the room knew they had just heard something that could not be walked back. At the plaintiff's table, the family froze. The mother's shoulders tightened. The father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. One of the children shifted uncomfortably, confusion and hurt written plainly across their face. These weren't abstract words anymore. They were words that had been spoken out loud, under oath, in a courtroom, words that confirmed everything the family had tried to explain. Judge Judy didn't react right away. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She didn't respond at all. She simply stopped moving. The pen in her hand rested on the desk. Her eyes stayed fixed on the neighbor. And the silence that followed was heavier than any argument that had come before it. It wasn't awkward silence. It was judgmental silence. The kind that tells you the room has already decided something before the verdict is spoken. The neighbor shifted again, clearly sensing that something had gone wrong. I didn't mean it in a bad way, they said too quickly now. I was just pointing out a difference. That's all. No one spoke. Judge Judy remained silent. The pause stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for the neighbor's confidence to begin unraveling. Long enough for the excuse to sound weaker each time it echoed in their own ears. Long enough for viewers at home to feel that familiar, electric tension. The moment where they know the hammer is about to fall. This is the moment where most people watching instinctively hit like, not because they're told to, but because they can feel it in their gut. Because they know what's about to happen next isn't just a ruling. It's accountability. Finally, Judge Judy leaned forward. Her voice, when it came, was calm. Controlled. But it carried an edge that cut straight through the room. So let me understand this, she said. You looked at a family. You looked at their children. And you made a comment about their skin color and the place they live. The neighbor opened their mouth to respond. Judge Judy raised a hand. I'm not finished. The courtroom was perfectly still. You didn't say it in anger, she continued. You didn't say it by accident. You said it casually, comfortably, like it was something you felt entitled to say. The neighbor tried to smile, tried to nod along, but it didn't work. The words had already done the damage. And then, Judge Judy added, when you were confronted, you didn't apologize. You didn't stop. You didn't think about how that might land on children. You decided the problem was everyone else. The neighbor swallowed. Judge Judy sat back again, the silence returning, but this time it felt final. The point of no return had been crossed. The comment was on the record. The excuse had failed. And whatever the case had been at the start of the day, it was something else now. The courtroom knew it. The family knew it. And the neighbor finally knew it too. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice when she began. She didn't need to. She picked up the neighbor's words and replayed them slowly, deliberately, as if placing each one under a microscope. Not paraphrased. Not softened. Exactly as they had been spoken. She repeated the phrasing about skin color. The implication of not belonging. The casual way it had been delivered. And as she did, the tone in the courtroom shifted from tension to gravity. Those weren't neutral words, she said calmly. They weren't harmless observations. In the law we look at patterns. We look at impact. And we look at behavior. She leaned forward slightly. What you described, repeated comments, targeted remarks directed at the same family in their own neighborhood, that's harassment. The word landed heavy. And when that behavior affects how people feel in their own home, she continued, when it creates fear, discomfort, or humiliation, especially over time, that becomes a hostile environment. The neighbor shook their head and tried to interject. I didn't mean it like that. Judge Judy raised her hand sharply. No. You don't get to redefine it now. The room went still again. You keep hiding behind intent, she said. Let me make something very clear to you. Intent doesn't erase harm. Ever. She turned her attention toward the family, then back to the neighbor. You weren't talking to adults who could simply walk away. You were talking where children could hear. Children who don't have the emotional tools to filter what you said. Children who take words like that home with them. Her voice didn't waver, but the message was unmistakable. You don't get to decide that those words didn't matter. The moment they were spoken, the damage was already done. Judge Judy reached for the documents in front of her and began laying them out in sequence. Let's talk about your behavior over time, she said. She pointed to the earliest complaint. A date. Then another. Then another. These aren't isolated incidents. This is a timeline. She flipped a page. Here's a complaint from 6 months ago. Here's another one 3 months later. And here's the voicemail you conveniently described as venting. The neighbor opened their mouth again. Judge Judy didn't even look up. I said I'm speaking. She continued calmly. This shows persistence. It shows fixation. And it shows that when you were asked to stop, you didn't. She looked directly at the neighbor now. You escalated. The neighbor shifted in their chair, their arms no longer crossed, their posture no longer confident. And when you came into this courtroom, Judge Judy went on, you didn't come in with remorse. You came in with excuses. She mimicked the tone without mocking it. It was a joke. They're too sensitive. That's not what I meant. She shook her head slowly. That's not accountability. That's deflection. The neighbor finally tried again to interrupt, voice tight with frustration. I just don't think. Judge Judy cut them off, cold and final. I'm not interested in what you think. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. I'm interested in what you did, she continued. And what you did was create an environment where a family felt targeted in their own home. Where parents had to explain to their children why an adult neighbor felt entitled to comment on their skin. She paused, letting that sink in. That's not a misunderstanding, she said. That's behavior. Judge Judy leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving the neighbor. You don't get to say something hurtful and then escape responsibility by calling it a joke. Jokes are funny. This wasn't funny. The neighbor's face flushed. Their confidence had evaporated completely now, replaced with a stiff, defensive silence. And one more thing, Judge Judy added. When someone tells you they're hurt and your response is to dismiss them, that tells me everything I need to know about your character. She gestured toward the family. They didn't come here asking for revenge. They came here because they were pushed. And the law does not reward people who push until someone finally breaks. The courtroom was quiet again, but this time it wasn't anticipation. It was understanding. The excuse had been dismantled piece by piece. There was nothing left to hide behind. Judge Judy gathered the papers in front of her, stacking them neatly. "This case is not about sensitivity," she said. "It's about responsibility." The neighbor stared down at the table, saying nothing. Judge Judy nodded once. "And now," she said, "we're going to talk about consequences." Judge Judy didn't rush the verdict. She looked down at the paperwork one last time, then back up at the family, then at the neighbor. The room was so quiet you could hear the rustle of paper as she adjusted the stack in front of her. When she finally spoke, her tone was firm, settled. The voice of someone who had already weighed every excuse and found them wanting. "I'm ruling for the family," she said plainly. In full. There was no drama in the delivery, no flourish. Just certainty. She explained the decision carefully, step by step, making it impossible to misunderstand. The neighbor's conduct, she said, wasn't a single offhand remark. It was repeated behavior. It was targeted. And it crossed the line from annoyance into harassment. The evidence showed a clear pattern, and the neighbor's own testimony confirmed it. "You don't get to create a hostile environment for people in their own home and then pretend it's harmless," she said. "That's not how the law works." The original claim had been small, a little over $2,000. Judge Judy acknowledged that amount, then moved beyond it. "In addition to the damages claimed," she continued, "I'm awarding compensation for emotional distress." The neighbor's head snapped up. Judge Judy didn't pause. "You don't get to measure emotional harm by whether you personally felt it," she said. "Words that make children feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood cause damage. That damage has value." She added court costs next. Filing fees. Documentation expenses. Time lost dealing with a situation that never should have escalated this far. By the time she finished listing the amounts, the total had climbed far beyond what anyone expected. The final number was more than double the original claim. The courtroom absorbed it all at once. At the plaintiff's table, the family didn't celebrate. There were no smiles, no cheers, no raised hands. Just a quiet release of tension. The mother closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath for months. The father nodded once, slowly, gratitude and relief written across his face. Their children sat a little straighter, the weight of the day finally lifting. Across the room, the neighbor looked stunned. The smug confidence from earlier was gone entirely. Their face had drained of color. Their mouth opened slightly, then closed again. They stared down at the desk, then back up at Judge Judy, as if hoping this was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. The embarrassment was unmistakable. Not just from the money, but from the public acknowledgement that their behavior had consequences. Judge Judy wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice steady but resolute. "This case isn't just about this family," she said. "It's about what we tolerate as a society." She gestured lightly with her hand. "In this country, people don't have to earn the right to live in their own neighborhood. They don't have to justify their presence. And they certainly don't have to explain their skin color to anyone." She looked directly at the neighbor. "When you speak, you're responsible for the impact of your words. Not just on adults who can argue back, but on children who are still learning who they are." Her gaze shifted briefly to the family. "No amount of money can erase what was said," she continued. "But accountability matters. And today that's what this court is providing." The neighbor said nothing. Judge Judy straightened the papers one last time. "Judgment for the plaintiffs," she concluded. "We're done." The gavel came down softly, but the message echoed. As the family gathered their things, there was a sense of quiet dignity in the way they stood. They didn't look victorious. They looked validated. Heard. The neighbor remained seated for a moment longer, clearly processing what had just happened, the reality of consequences settling in. And for everyone watching, this was the moment that stayed with them. Because if this case reminded you that words still matter in this country, that dignity still matters, then this is exactly the kind of justice worth following. Subscribe, because every week, accountability speaks loud, and behavior meets consequences. And now, one question for you: should mocking someone's skin color carry real consequences? Let us know below.